When the guillotine was first introduced, many believed it was a fast and humane way to carry out executions. But almost immediately, disturbing stories began to spread. Witnesses claimed severed heads still moved and seemed aware for several seconds after the blade fell. What actually happened in those final moments became one of history's most unsettling debates. In 16th and 17th century Europe, public executions were actually public performances, designed to remind everyone watching exactly who was in charge. And the method of killing depended entirely on a person's place in society. If it was a nobleman convicted of a serious crime, they died by sword or axe, which was considered an honorable enough death for someone of their status. If it were a common criminal with no money or title, they were hanged, which meant slow strangulation at the end of a rope, sometimes taking several minutes. And if the government really wanted to send a message, they used something called breaking on the wheel. An executioner would use a heavy iron bar to smash the person's arms and legs one by one, then the spine, and then leave them still alive, still conscious, strapped to a large cartwheel raised on a post, where they would stay until they died from shock and blood loss. That could take hours. Beheading was supposed to be the merciful option, but it had a serious problem. It depended entirely on the skill of the person swinging the blade, and that skill varied wildly. An experienced swordsman with a sharp blade could take a head off cleanly in a single stroke. But most executions used an axe, which was heavier, harder to control, and far less forgiving if the condemned moved at the wrong moment or the executioner misjudged the angle. The results were often horrific. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, the former Queen of Scotland who'd been imprisoned by her cousin Queen Elizabeth I of England for 19 years, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in England. It took 3 blows of the axe, and even after that, the executioner had to saw through the remaining tissue with the blade's edge to finish the job. The 300 people who'd gathered to witness the execution left in visible shock. This kind of botched execution wasn't rare. It was practically routine, and when it happened, crowds who had come expecting a swift, formal death often turned angry. But the brutality was never an accident. It was intentional. The more visible the suffering, the clearer the message. France in the 1780s was running this exact same system. But then on December 1st, 1789, a doctor named Joseph Ignace Guillotin stood up in the French National Assembly and made a suggestion that the entire chamber immediately found hilarious. France was 6 months into its revolution at this point, and lawmakers were in the middle of drafting a brand new legal system for a country that had just declared all its citizens equal under the law. Guillotin's argument was that if France was going to keep executing people, the method of execution should reflect that equality. It shouldn't matter if it were an aristocrat or a poor laborer. They should die the same way, with the same speed, and with as little suffering as possible. His solution was a mechanical beheading device that would do the job reliably and instantly, every single time, without depending on the skill or mood of an executioner. When he suggested that the machine would work so fast the condemned would feel nothing more than a slight sensation at the back of the neck, the room burst out laughing. The idea of a killing machine sounded more like a dark joke than a serious policy proposal. Nobody was laughing 2 years later. France's updated legal code in 1791 established that going forward, every person sentenced to death, regardless of their background, would be executed by decapitation. But that decision immediately created a practical problem. France simply didn't have enough trained executioners to carry this out, and training skilled swordsmen would take years. So the government decided to build the machine Guillotin had described. The job of designing it went to a surgeon named Antoine Louis, who was the permanent secretary of the French Academy of Surgery, essentially one of the most senior medical figures in the country. Louis partnered with a German instrument maker named Tobias Schmidt, and by early 1792 they'd built a working prototype. The most important design choice was the angle of the blade. Instead of falling straight down like an axe, which would have required enormous force and might not cut cleanly, the blade was angled at 45 degrees, so it sliced through the neck diagonally. That single design decision made the cut dramatically faster and more reliable. The person to be executed was strapped face down to a flat wooden board called a bascule, which would tilt forward so they were lying horizontally with their neck over the cutting area. A curved wooden piece called the lunette held the neck in place, while a matching upper piece locked down over it. Then a blade weighing about 7 kilograms was released from a height of roughly 3 meters, sliding down greased wooden rails. The whole process, from the moment the condemned was secured to the moment the blade fell, only took seconds. On April 17, 1792, the prototype was tested at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris using fresh corpses, and it worked exactly as intended. 8 days later, on April 25th, the device was used on a living person for the first time. The condemned was Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, a highway robber, executed at the Place de Grève in central Paris. The crowd that turned out was accustomed to executions that involved several minutes of visible suffering. What they saw instead was something over almost instantly. Several witnesses later said the crowd seemed more confused than satisfied. It had happened too fast to feel like the spectacle they'd come to watch. The machine was originally called the Louisette or the Louison, named after Antoine Louis, who designed it. But because Guillotined had been so publicly vocal about execution reform in the years leading up to it, the public started associating his name with the device. And that association stuck permanently, despite his constant efforts to separate himself from it. He was reportedly mortified by it for the rest of his life. When he died in 1814 at the age of 75, his family formally asked the French government to rename the machine. The government said no. Within a year of its first use, guillotine had become the central tool of one of the largest government-organized mass killings in European history. By late 1792, the French Revolution had moved far beyond its original goals of liberty and equal rights. France was now at war with two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, Austria and Prussia, both of which wanted to crush the revolution before it inspired similar uprisings in their own countries. Inside France, food was scarce, prices had collapsed, and multiple political factions were fighting each other over control of the government. The country was in a state of genuine crisis, and radical politicians were increasingly arguing that the only way to protect the revolution was to destroy anyone who might threaten it. In April 1793, a 12-man emergency governing body called the Committee of Public Safety took effective control of France. The first high-profile demonstration of what that meant came on January 21, 1793, when King Louis XVI was guillotined at the Place de la Révolution, a large public square in the center of Paris that is today known as the Place de la Concorde. Louis was 38 years old. He'd been under house arrest since June 1971, when he and his family had tried to flee France disguised as servants and were caught at the town of Varennes near the Belgian border. His execution was unlike anything Europe had seen before. No ruling monarch had ever been publicly killed by his own government through a formal legal process. Every royal court on the continent understood the message. 9 months after Louis, on October 16, 1793, his wife, Marie Antoinette, was executed at the same location. She was 37 years old and had spent the previous 2.5 months in solitary confinement in the Conciergerie, a former royal palace that had been converted into a prison, completely cut off from her children, the youngest of whom was only 8. What followed those 2 executions became known as the Reign of Terror, a 10-month period running from September 1793 to July 1794, during which the revolutionary government systematically executed anyone it labeled an enemy of the revolution. The Paris Revolutionary Tribunal alone sentenced 2,600 people to death during that period. Across all of France, the official execution count reached approximately 16,500 people. On top of that, historians estimate that between 10,000 and 40,000 more people died in prisons across the country without ever receiving a trial. In the beginning, the people being executed were most likely those you'd expect: aristocrats, Catholic priests who refused to swear loyalty to the new government, and suspected foreign spies. But the definition of enemy of the revolution kept expanding. By mid-1794, grain merchants accused of charging too much, farmers who hadn't met government supply quotas, and ordinary citizens denounced by their own neighbors for saying the wrong thing at a dinner table were all being sent to the scaffold. At the height of the terror, in June and July of 1794, the guillotine in Paris was killing between 50 and 60 people each day. The chief executioner at the time was a man named Charles-Henri Sanson, who came from a family that had served as Paris's official executioners since 1688. The position had been passed down through generations like a trade. Sanson had personally executed Louis XVI and carried out hundreds of killings during the terror. In accounts he gave later in his life, he described the pace of killing as completely unmanageable. His team worked in shifts just to keep the machine maintained and operational. At one point, the executions had to be moved from the Place de la Révolution to a different square, the Place du Trône Renversé, because the sheer volume of blood draining from the scaffold was contaminating a nearby fountain's water supply. On July 28, 1794, the terror ended the same way it had been ending everyone else, with the guillotine. Maximilien Robespierre, the 36-year-old lawyer and politician who'd been the most powerful voice on the Committee of Public Safety, and the man most directly responsible for the scale of the killings, was arrested and brought to the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. The day before, during his arrest, he'd suffered a severe gunshot wound to his lower jaw. Whether from an assassination attempt or his own hand, historians still disagree. By the time he arrived at the scaffold, his jaw was shattered and held in place by a blood-soaked bandage. The executioner removed it before securing his neck in the lunette. Robespierre cried out. The blade fell, and with it, the organized mass killings came to an end. But the machine that had carried them out did not. From the moment the guillotine method started being used, doctors who witnessed executions found themselves wondering if a person stayed conscious after their head was cut off. People standing right there at the scaffold kept reporting that severed heads appeared to blink, move their jaw, and change facial expression in the seconds after the blade fell. Doctors argued about whether these were genuine signs of awareness, meaning the person was still somehow experiencing something, or whether it was just the nervous system firing off its last automatic signals, the way a headless chicken will sometimes keep running for a few seconds before collapsing. The body can do a surprising number of things on autopilot without any brain involvement at all. The most famous early case was Charlotte Corday. She was a 24-year-old woman from Normandy who was guillotined on July 17, 1793, after assassinating a man named Jean-Paul Marat, who was one of the most influential and feared radical journalists of the Revolution, who she stabbed while he was sitting in a medicinal bath he used to treat a painful skin condition. After the blade fell and her head was separated from her body, one of the executioner's assistants picked up her head and slapped it hard across the cheek while holding it up for the crowd to see. Multiple witnesses said her face visibly reacted. They described what looked like an expression of offense or anger. The story spread across Paris within hours. Nobody could agree on what it meant, but it was impossible to ignore. And it pushed doctors and scientists to start taking the question seriously. The most careful documented attempt to actually study this came more than a century later. On June 28, 1905, a French doctor named Gabriel Boréau attended the execution of a convicted murderer named Henri Languille at a prison in the city of Orléans. Boréau had deliberately positioned himself beside the scaffold, specifically to observe the severed head the moment the blade fell. What he recorded afterward was deeply unsettling. For the first few seconds, Languille's eyelids and lips showed irregular twitching, then went still. Boréau then called out Languille's name, loudly and clearly. The eyelids, which had closed, opened. The eyes moved and looked directly at Boréau's face, and according to his account, held that gaze for somewhere between 5 and 6 seconds with what he described as genuinely focused attention. He called the name a second time. The eyes opened again, held contact briefly, then closed for good. Boréau published this account in a French medical journal called Archives d'Anthropologie Criminelle, and he was completely certain that what he saw was not a reflex. He believed Languille had been briefly, genuinely conscious after decapitation. That account has never been proven wrong, but science has given us strong reasons to doubt it. The core issue is that the brain needs a constant supply of fresh, oxygenated blood to stay conscious. That blood is delivered through two large blood vessels in the neck called the carotid arteries, and the guillotine blade cuts straight through both of them. The moment those arteries are severed, blood pressure inside the brain drops to almost nothing within 1 to 2 seconds. To put that in perspective, fighter pilots who experience sudden, extreme G-forces, the physical pressure that pushes blood away from the brain during sharp aerial maneuvers, lose consciousness in about 5 to 10 seconds. Animal studies, where blood flow to the brain is stopped suddenly, show similar timelines. So even if Borreau's observation was completely accurate, it was happening right at the very edge of what the brain could physically support. The most useful modern research on this came from a 2011 study at Radboud University in the Netherlands, published in one of the world's leading science journals, PNAS. Researchers measured brain activity in rats immediately after decapitation. What they found was surprising. In the first 3 to 5 seconds after the cut, there was actually a brief spike in a specific type of brain activity called gamma wave oscillations. In a living conscious brain, gamma waves are associated with active perception, with the brain actually processing what it's seeing, hearing, and feeling. After that brief spike, activity declined rapidly and stopped completely at around 30 seconds. The researchers were careful not to claim this proved rats were conscious, but it did show that the brain doesn't just switch off the instant blood supply ends. So what about all those witnesses who saw blinking, jaw movement, and changing expressions? There is a straightforward scientific explanation for most of it. The brainstem, the lower part of the brain that sits at the top of the spinal cord and controls automatic body functions, can keep triggering basic physical reflexes for a short time, even after the higher parts of the brain have stopped working. Blinking, jaw movement, and small changes in facial muscle tension are all brainstem-level reflexes. They don't require any conscious thought. They're the body's last automatic signals, not evidence of a person still experiencing the world. As for the rush of color witnesses saw on Charlotte Corday's cheeks after she was slapped, that's most likely explained by the blood vessels in her face widening suddenly in response to the physical impact, not by an emotional reaction. After 1794, the guillotine kept running for the next 183 years. The first major change came gradually during the first half of the 1800s, when executions stopped happening in public squares and moved inside prison courtyards instead. Part of the reason was that public executions had always drawn enormous crowds, and those crowds were becoming harder and harder to control. But part of it was also about image. France was increasingly presenting itself to the world as the birthplace of modern civilization and human rights. And it was getting difficult to square that self-image with the reality of killing people in front of street food vendors and children. The last public guillotine execution in French history happened on June 17, 1939, outside the Saint-Pierre prison in the city of Versailles. The condemned was a German man named Eugen Weidmann, who had been convicted of 6 murders. A crowd had been gathering through the night to secure a good view. Someone filmed the execution, the footage got out, and the public reaction was so negative that the government immediately and permanently moved all future executions behind prison walls. But then on September 10, 1977, even the prison executions came to an end. There was a 28-year-old man named Hamida Jandoubi who was guillotined in the courtyard of Baumet prison in the city of Marseille in southern France. Jandoubi had been convicted of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering a 21-year-old woman named Elisabeth Bousquet, whom he had previously forced into prostitution. The execution was watched by fewer than a dozen prison officials. There had been no public announcement that it was going to happen. Hamida Jandoubi was the last person ever killed by the guillotine anywhere in the world.